Hi, this is Paul, and I've done something that I usually don't do. Most of you know I don't usually reach out to authors about their books. I usually just read their books. But this Kevin Flatt is a professor at Redeemer University, which is closely connected to the Christian Reformed Church. And when I started reading his book, I saw the immediate application for a lot of what I've been working through, and by proxy, a lot of what you have been sort of thinking about. And so I really wanted to get Kevin on the channel. He's, well, so I figured I'd rando him first. That's what we call what we do here, because we talk to random people on the internet. And then we will dig into his book. And like I said, I'm very, very excited about this conversation because I think I often, when I do talk to authors about their books, it's often the case that I am frustrated because I know lots of other books will sell more copies, but I think this is a really important book. And I also know that a lot of academics live in frustration because they write these books and hardly anybody reads them. So we'll see what we can do about that. So Kevin, I really appreciate you taking the time out and coming in for a conversation.
Well, I'm delighted to talk to you, Paul. And I was very happy when you reached out, not only to get a chance to talk about the book, but just to be involved in these conversations that you've been hosting and leading. I've been digging into some of your prior videos, and we have a lot of interest in common. So I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about today.
Terrific. Well, let's begin with the home you grew up in. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I grew up here in Southern Ontario, in a town called Kitchener. It's about an hour west of Toronto. And kind of mid-sized city. We're up around, I think, 350,000 or so, and grew up in a Christian home, uh, mostly in sort of a Wesleyan pietist kind of tradition. Wonderful way to grow up, part of a really good church community, really good family. And I remain deeply grateful for that. Got involved in sort of broader evangelical circles as I grew up into my teen years, and ended up pursuing first studies in economics at the undergrad level. I did a degree in economics, which I still draw on to some degree, teaching history. But history was really my first love. And so when I decided that I was going to go on to graduate school, I decided to switch back to history as kind of my main focus. Did a master's and a PhD in that. And just as I was coming towards the end of my PhD studies, I saw a job posting to teach a course part-time at this place at that time called Redeemer University College, which, despite doing my PhD just down the road at McMaster University, at that point I actually had not heard of. And I was like, there's a Christian university, half an hour away from here. I had no idea. And a lot of your listeners are probably Americans. In the US, there's tons of Christian universities, Christian undergraduate liberal arts colleges. In Canada, it's actually pretty rare. So in Ontario, in terms of fully accredited to offer degrees, there's really only two Christian undergraduate institutions in all of Ontario, which is Canada's most populated province. Yeah, so I thought, what is this place all about? And Redeemer is in the Reformed tradition, and we can get into some of this later, maybe, but draws really inspiration from Neocalvinism, from the thinking of people like Abraham Kuyper, Herman Dooyeweerd, Herman Bavinck, and that was all new to me. It resonated with a lot of my convictions. I'd been searching for, how do I develop a biblical Christian worldview and how do I apply that to the work that I'm doing as a aspiring scholar. But there were a ton of gaps in my thinking about how my faith related to other aspects of life. And this whole stream of this particular stream of Reformed thought really had excellent answers to a lot of those questions, filled in a lot of those gaps for me. And so it's overstating it a little bit, but it was almost like a second conversion to have this all these vistas open up about how does God and our faith relate to all of this other stuff. And that, as Providence would have it, a full-time position opened up at Redeemer just shortly after that, and not so much because of anything great about me, because presumably God had some kind of plan. I was hired here, and I've been here ever since. That was almost 18 years ago,
Wow.
and I've continued to grow and learn, and have loved being here. Now, yeah, married, three wonderful kids, back living in my hometown of Kitchener, which makes for a little bit of a commute, but means we're close to family as well, which is important. Yeah, so that's a little bit. Happy to dig into any of that a little bit more,
Well,
Paul, if anything
let's
sparks an
dig in a
interest.
little bit to growing up. Now, you touched on a little bit in the Kiwitas podcast, but the one of the differences between Canada and the US is a obviously an enormous place with lots of regional differences. Canada's pretty much known for being quite secular. So, in terms of as a teenager and a young adult, how did you sort of navigate this secular Christian thing? And if there's any stories in there about sort of important moments where you sort of made the faith your own. You know, you
Mhm.
grew up in a Christian home, but sort of said, okay, well, this isn't, I am going to continue to practice Christianity. I'm going to continue to connect with the church. And, you know, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's very true. So Canada, both in terms of like the numbers of people who are serious practicing Christians of one kind or another, it's a lot lower than the US as a proportion of the population, at least in most parts of the country. But also the broader kind of public culture, and I don't just mean politics, but I mean entertainment, news media, all kinds of things, is just more secular than in the US. So growing up as in a Christian family where that was taken seriously, and then more and more in my high school years, really identifying myself as a Christian as kind of the most fundamental identity that I had. It never seemed like that was the majority option. It always felt like, there were only a handful of us. I went to public schools all through my education. Um, in my generation, for a lot of evangelicals in Canada, there was the sense that public education was sort of neutral, like kind of neutral space. And outside of reform circles, there wasn't a ton of interest in Christian education. So yeah, my family was one of those, and so I went to public schools, and um, I always felt like, maybe at most one out of 10 people that I went to school with was a Christian in any kind of meaningful sense. So very much felt like part of a minority report, compared to where my peers were at. And it was for me, yeah, I grew up in a strong Christian home. Um, and my parents, my mother in particular, really instrumental in raising us in the faith and making sure that we knew scripture. Um, but all of us who are Christians as adults, there has to come that time where, as you said it, you make it your own and you really embrace what you've been raised in. And so for me, that really happened as a teenager, uh, kind of grade 11, grade 12. We had grade 13 in Ontario in those days, grade 13 in high school. Yeah, and so there were a few different influences in that. One key influence, we had a youth group, and one of the people who taught us Sunday school for the high school age kids, a guy named John Montgomery, really challenged us to know the Bible. We spent a lot of time just digging in, like reading through books of the Bible together and trying to interpret what was going on. So he was a key influence. Another guy, Hendrik van der Bregen. He's a philosopher, actually, recently retired as an academic philosopher. He was doing his PhD at the time, and he was part of our church. And he did some stuff on apologetics and thinking Christianly about some difficult philosophical questions. And as a more intellectually inclined teenager, that was really important for me, that I could kind of connect. Okay, I like to think things through. I like to ask these deep questions. My faith is not separate from that, but these things can be in conversation. You don't have to be afraid of hard questions. There are good answers to those questions. So that and a number of other things were just instrumental. So I think for me, it's sort of around age 16, 17, 18 where I really embraced the Christian faith as my own. And growing up in an adult baptism tradition, I was baptized then, age 17. Um, yeah, so that it kind of intersected at that point then with my educational journey that continued out from there.
In college, did you participate in church or were there campus ministries or what was that like for you at college?
Yeah, so because I was in my hometown, my undergrad was at the University of Waterloo, which is Waterloo is kind of right next to Kitchener. So I lived at home during my undergrad years, which saved me a lot of money, although you do miss out on certain experiences that way. But as a result, I was able to continue to participate in my local church, and so a lot of my involvement wasn't in campus ministries, but was through the local church. I was involved in a little bit of stuff on campus as well, but it was more both undergrad and grad school was where I had a lot of opportunities to have conversations with non-Christians about the gospel, something that I started trying to do in high school, but really was able to do a lot more of um, in undergrad and grad school. And something that I actually have less opportunities to do on a day-to-day basis now, working at a Christian institution. Often those years when you're doing your education, if you're in that kind of mixed environment, that's when you have a lot of great conversations with people of all sorts of different perspectives, Muslim friends, hardcore atheist friends, lots of people just, not really sure what they thought, asking questions, interested, exploring. Yeah, so that was a really good time in that way.
Now, I had heard about Redeemer. I've known people who've gone there, and I just had my first opportunity to visit when I was at Synod last
Yes.
summer. And whenever Synod is not in Grand Rapids, Class Central California has a hard time finding people willing to go. When
Mm.
it's in Grand Rapids, of course, everybody wants to go because their in-laws live there or they grew up there, and so they all want the free ticket. But I like going to other places besides Grand Rapids because I've been there plenty. And so this was my opportunity to go see um, Redeemer. And I was really impressed. I like small institutions because I think one of the most important aspects of those that period of life are the relationships that you build with your professors, small class sizes. Redeemer also sort of has an interesting housing situation where you sort of live in pods with other students and you have to fend for yourself. Rather, I went to Calvin, so we had large dormitories and a dining hall, and I very much enjoyed that. But I really appreciated a lot of that's the philosophy behind Redeemer and how Redeemer is sort of, I probably understood they were going to be small, but figured how can we use small as our advantage? So you've been there a while. Maybe, tell me a little bit about your experience at Redeemer and what you think of it.
I love Redeemer. Um, as I mentioned earlier, it's been instrumental in my own life. Not just because I work here and have a job here, and it's allowed me to do this amazing thing, which is getting paid to read stuff and talk about ideas and write, and lately do academic administration. But also because it's shaped my own outlook on the world in so many ways, being connected with this deep, rich, reformed tradition of thought. But yeah, I almost want to zoom out a little bit or go further back and just and talk a little bit about the founding of Redeemer. So, if you go back to the 1970s, um, most of the universities in Ontario and most of Canada had actually been founded as Christian institutions originally, but had secularized by the mid 20th century, roughly. And then there were still some denominationally affiliated schools, but most of them had become like satellite colleges affiliated with public universities, what we call church colleges here, and to varying degrees preserved some sense of denominational identity, but from my perspective, had pretty much kind of integrated into the predominant secular public model. And then in the 70s, a bunch of mostly Dutch Canadian Reformed folks here who'd been active in the Christian schooling movement at lower levels, the elementary level, the secondary or high school level, said, we really need a Christian undergraduate university that is reformed and that is very distinctively Christian. And one of the big emphases of the Neo-Calvinist tradition or the Kuyperian tradition is that Christian faith is relevant at a fundamental level for every discipline. It's not just theology or ministry training, but there's a Christian way to approach history, to approach social sciences, to approach biology, right? Um, it's not just throwing on a bunch of Bible verses, but it's really working at the theoretical, the philosophical level as a Christian. And so they really saw a need, and it was an uphill battle. There were no independent, well, there were first of all, there were no private or independent universities at all in Ontario, and there were no Christian ones.
Wow.
At one point, they were told, this is part of the lore of Redeemer, a government official met with them and told them a Christian university is a contradiction in terms, which not only betrays an appalling lack of historical awareness of the history of the university as an institution in Western civilization, which of course was founded by Christians to be a Christian institution, was Christian for hundreds of years. But also, tells you something about the climate at that time in the 70s. But they persevered and, by God's grace, eventually were granted the right to offer initially a Bachelor of Christian Studies degree, later a Bachelor of Arts degree and a Bachelor of Science degree, then a Bachelor of Education, which is used for teacher training here. And in more recent years, we now have degree granting authority to grant graduate degrees. So we're rolling out our first master's programs now. We've got a master's of education that's launching, a master's of counseling that's launching. So, that's kind of the context. Redeemer as it's sort of like a David and Goliath scenario, right? It's totally against the odds that we even exist here. So it's a really inspiring story. And I think, for those of us who know the story, it gives us a sense of we're really bringing something to the table that otherwise wouldn't exist, or at least wouldn't be well represented in this really secular environment. And we love working with our colleagues at secular institutions. I've got tons of friends at nearby public universities, like collaborating with them, working with them. And there's lots of good things happening there as well. But without Redeemer, and there's one other similar institution, um, there just wouldn't be a distinctively Christian institutional presence that is doing the kind of thing that we're trying to do. That is to some degree independent from what's happening in the public system. Yeah, so I've been here for, as I said, it'll be 18 years this summer on a full-time basis. And we've had our ups and downs. It's a challenging thing to run a private university, even more so in Canada, where tuition tends to be a lot lower and there are a lot fewer private institutions. So almost everybody thinks public only. They're not even aware that there's other options. And so, even in my time at Redeemer, there's been times where we have, struggled with enrollment, struggled financially. Thankfully, we have been on a real growth trajectory for the last, well, more than 5 years now. And that's given us a lot of opportunities to reach a lot more students and do a lot of good things. But yeah, one of the things that I just love the most about Redeemer is from the beginning, it was founded with this conviction that you could bring your Christian faith into any area of study, any discipline, any subject matter. Um, and what that means in a discipline like history, it's not that you come in and you say, we're only going to focus on Christian history or church history. We do talk a lot about Christian history and church history. It's important. But we talk about all kinds of history. But we do it in such a way that what we're aiming for is that the basic underlying assumptions, the presuppositions, the worldview level, theory level, philosophical level stuff that's always operating when you're studying any subject, but usually is kind of hidden or implicit. We really strive to, in the words of the New Testament, to bring that into subjection to Christ, to bring that under the lordship of Christ. Our motto as an institution is Agnus Dei Omnium Rex, which in Latin is the Lamb of God is king over everything. And so when Redeemer was founded, initially I think they had 8 founding faculty members. This is back in 1982. And they're like, one of them is going to be a physicist, right? So th this was a terrible financial decision. Physics is never going to be a super popular program in terms of like bringing in tons of students, making lots of money. But it was a statement of conviction that to be a Christian university doesn't mean that you only focus on theology, maybe philosophy, maybe church history, but actually everything, including the quote unquote hard sciences, you can be a Christian and bring your faith into how you do that. And so we've continued to stand by that and continue to try to work that out imperfectly, but that's always been our goal.
Why do you think? Hmm. So, you recognize this. America and the United States and Canada have a very interesting relationship, and Canadians know that better than Americans, who just tend to ignore Canada. But the this difference in terms of the number of self-consciously Christian universities really surprises me. It doesn't surprise me that the Christian Reformed Church and the Dutch Calvinists would found that because, of course, I'm third. Two of my children went to Calvin. Dort. We have a fair quite a bit of this is fairly familiar with us in the
Mhm.
United States. Why so rare in Canada? I mean, and part of this, I think, very much going to get into the secularization story, where, up until far more recently than the United States, part of the British realm, I was watching King Charles's vows, all of the vows he had to make for his coronation. And when you sit there and listen to them today, it's like, wow. You don't really mean many of these things at all, do you? I mean, the governance that he has over the church and the things he's supposed to defend as the king. And Canada, of course, this nation of, percentage wise, large immigration swings. Of course, that's how the Dutchmen came in after the war, and you've continued to have, concurrent waves of immigration. I would have thought that there would have been more communities, immigrant communities that would set up sort of their own thing. But maybe that's more of an American thing and not a Canadian thing. I'm sort of confused by this.
So there's a few different things going on. Like if we're trying to explain why are there fewer Christian institutions of higher education in Canada versus the US on a per capita basis, as well as in absolute terms, I think there's a few different kind of layers of what's going on there. So one of them is in kind of a long-term historical perspective, there's less denominational diversity in Canada in terms of who has market share of the population. So if you go back to even as recently as 70 years ago, kind of mid 20th century, um, almost all of the Protestants, like 4/5 maybe of the Protestants in Canada, and I mean maybe that number is not exactly right, but so we're talking rough figures here. But the overwhelming majority of Protestants in Canada were concentrated in 3 or 4 denominations. So Anglican Church of Canada, that's equivalent to the Episcopal Church USA. Uh, Presbyterian Church of Canada, that's similar to the PCUSA. And then we have something that doesn't really have an exact analog in the US, which is the United Church of Canada. A lot of my earlier research was on that. And the United Church was made up of a merger of the Methodist Church in Canada, a big chunk of the Presbyterians, and the Congregationalists. They all came together in 1925. And so they became the biggest Protestant denomination. And even today, if you just ask people, what denomination do you belong to, they're still the biggest Protestant denomination. Very, very theologically liberal, very progressive. Um, and then a few others. There's Lutherans. There's some larger Baptist denominations. But so to begin with, if you're looking at English-speaking Canada, which is 3/4, very roughly of the population, um, there's only a few denominations that have most of the market share, and they're kind of mainline Protestant denominations, which, like their counterparts in the US, really have kind of collapsed numerically, have really liberalized theologically, which, and of course, liberals will make a different kind of case for why they think that that's been a good thing. But for those of us who, continue to believe in the tenets of traditional historic Orthodox Christianity, it's amounted to a sort of evacuation of content, the core theological content from a lot of historic Christianity. And of course, they've also just, as I mentioned, been in numerical collapse since the 1960s, which is becoming increasingly desperate. So the upshot of that is lots and lots of Canadians 20 years ago, even when we have a religion question on our census, the government census. So when you ask them, what's your religion? Lots and lots of Canadians in the English speaking parts of the country will say, I'm United, I'm Anglican, I'm Presbyterian. And what they mean is, I vaguely remember that my grandmother went to the Anglican Church or the United Church. Maybe we go at Christmas and Easter. But we don't really have any meaningful connection for most of them to the church. And when we do, we're actually not really hearing historic Christianity preached or portrayed in a way that would have been recognizable to the 19th century forebearers of those denominations. So, in other words, as I said actually on the podcast with Peter Lighthart and James Wood that you mentioned, one way to think about this is that the religious landscape of English Canada is kind of like New England in the US. It used to be dominated by a few mainline Protestant denominations that have really not been doing well. That's left behind some Catholics who now are kind of the biggest denomination, where there's actually like some degree of participation. There's not a really large evangelical segment, and it's evangelical Protestantism throughout the Western world in the last 200 years that has been most kind of secularization resistant, has been able to sustain the most robust levels of Christian activity. But it's relatively small in Canada. Gets a little bit bigger as you move westwards. But the other big thing in Canada, I keep talking about English Canada, and a lot of you are like, what do you mean English speaking Canada? Well, of course, one of Canada's largest provinces, Quebec, historically is a French speaking, historically Catholic province. Canada was colonized, or kind of the central parts of Canada, what is now Canada, were colonized first by the French. And so this French-speaking society grew up on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. That's lasted for hundreds of years. And until the 1950s, it was a very devout Catholic society. The self-understanding of Quebec Catholics was, we have preserved the faith that France has abandoned. Our like ancestors in France, France has followed the secular path. We are the true faithful children of the church, though. We've kept close to the church, and the church, institutionally, the Catholic Church had this massive role in Quebec, running education, running healthcare, running social services. And that changed very dramatically in the 1960s. The church was pushed out of most of those things. It was taken over by the provincial government. They were secularized. So there's this change in the social role. There's also um, almost kind of a crisis of self-confidence of the Catholic Church that has a lot to do with the Second Vatican Council that occurred in the 1960s and trying to figure out like how should the church relate to the world. And by and large, Quebecers, the Quebecois, stopped going to church, stopped being involved, stopped becoming priests, stopped becoming nuns, stopped becoming monks or members of religious orders. And so Quebec, within, 2 generations, went from being, in terms of almost any statistic you can measure, the most pious jurisdiction in North America to the least. So today, Quebec looks much more like France, very, very secular. And so you put those two things together, the fact that in English Canada, it's dominated by mainline Protestantism, which has theologically liberalized and gone into numerical collapse over the last, half century. And you have this dramatic collapse of Catholicism in Quebec, which is kind of the other main historic pillar Christian culture in Canada. And so, in general, there's been a secularization of institutions in Canada that have been historically connected with one or the other of those main pillars. And what that means is that for higher education, we had lots of institutions of higher education that were affiliated with one or the other of the Protestant churches. But most of them were pretty happy to go along with, we'll take government funding in return for either completely secularizing, or in the case of these affiliated church colleges, accepting kind of a secular framework that really limits to what extent we can be really distinctive from the perspective of our denominational tradition. And this is true in a number of areas in Canada. There's a less robust institutional private sector in a number of domains in Canada. The public sector is a bit bigger, and that's definitely true in education, where there's private forms of education just in general have a lot less market share. And that's especially true at the university level, where it's just so much more expensive to offer education at that level. So yeah, that there's a few other things going on, but I think that explains most of it, why
Yeah.
we just don't have that same vibrant independent Christian higher ed sector in Canada.
Well, I think the last point you made about the government involvement, one of the points in your book that you got into, of course, are these different layers of, I don't know if we got we already got to get into this the sacred social order, layers of application of the sacred social order, and the governmental layer is, the point that you made about the sort of the assumptions that the Europe Europe figured out how to Europe figured out how to deal with the Christian pluralism in Europe. Your point that, well, they didn't really, because for, well beyond the Reformational shock, governments in Europe continued to police their own boundaries with respect to what in American eyes would be confessional distinctives. And there has been a process of relaxation, which again makes the United States a rather interesting study, because all over Europe, despite their differences in the different countries, as they all sort of relaxed, the United States, which begins as a supposedly, I mean, famously, the word God does not appear in the American Constitution. There certainly is a creator in the Declaration of Independence. But in America, you get this dynamic where, perhaps all of these, during a particular period, all of these nonconformists will broaden that term, escape Europe, come to America in order to set up their own little kingdoms of God on earth in many ways. One of my early videos, I had somebody approach me from New Haven, Connecticut, and he was very excited because he'd been digging into the history of that city, and to his shock, discovered that this was one among many New England utopian reformed projects of establishing God's kingdom here on earth. So it's interesting listening to you talk about the role, how in Canada, the public sector, the government sector has eaten up more, let's say, of the cultural stewardship than the private sector. And so to what degree does, I'd say, especially in Canada, where you have, high degrees of pluralism, you've got more self-conscious, as a percent, because your population is quite a bit smaller. Your indigenous population obviously has a force. You always had the Canadian sort of Protestant forces. So to what degree do you think that accelerated secularity in terms of Canadian governmental history?
So this is a great question, and I don't know that we have a satisfying answer to that. Some have suggested, so, Mark Knoll, for example, well-known American historian of Christianity, who unusually for an American historian has always had a real interest in Canadian history. So he suggests he's got an article where he digs into some of this, and he suggests that that's probably one factor is that the expansion of particularly government social programs um, rendered a lot of what the churches had been doing kind of redundant. And I think there's some truth to that, although I think a couple of caveats that I think Professor Knoll would probably agree with. So one is a lot of the churches had actually been pushing for that in the Protestant, mainline Protestant churches. You know, they really wanted the government to get more involved in delivering social programs. So that was one of their goals. And of course, it's easy for us to forget, but in mid-20th century English-speaking Canada, the people running the mainline Protestant denominations and the people running the government are the same people. Like the politicians are going to those churches. They're coming from the same circles. They're part of the same kind of elite sector of Canadian society. Um, so that's one caveat. The other caveat is, of course, the government taking over certain social functions only renders churches redundant if they don't have other things that they do uniquely as churches. And of course, that's one of the vulnerabilities of a certain type of progressive or liberal Christianity that emphasizes Christianity as basically like a social movement, as a form of social activism, uh, especially if they're essentially taking their cues from secular political thinking, typically on the secular left, is, well, if you have political parties and you have government social programs and you have secular activist movements, what is the church for? Like, what is the church doing other than maybe to kind of cheer those things on? Whereas more kind of historically grounded forms of Christianity say, well, I mean, the main reason we're here, the central reason we're here as churches, is the administration of the sacraments and the preaching of the word. And so, our most important job is always uniquely ours. And that's, and I would say from a more reform perspective, yes, the churches should be a stimulus to social reform, to social involvement, to certain kinds of social activism. Um, but as a byproduct of their central task of discipline, word, sacrament, Christian formation. Um, so yeah, so I think there is something to that idea. But the government taking over certain areas of life in and of itself does not, I think, tell you whether those things will be secular. And this is one of the things that I argue in the book is it's a mistake to think that something is secular if it's not run by the church. Secular in a substantive sense, like that it's being run without reference to God. Because if you look at the history of Western Christendom, yes, the church as an institution plays a really important role, but so do other institutions that conceive of themselves in Christian terms and conceive of themselves as having a Christian task, which are not, in many historical periods, in any way institutionally subservient to the church institution.
Right.
So you can think of Christian monarchs and Christian governments, including Christian republics, where the government itself, independent of any sort of ecclesiastical control, understands its task in Christian terms. My favorite example is, again, the history of the university, where universities in the Middle Ages had an astonishing degree of institutional autonomy because they had been founded typically by these papal charters and often also monarchical or princely charters that basically exempted them from the jurisdiction of most secular and temporal authorities, secular in the medieval sense of political
Right.
authorities. They could basically do what they wanted. And that's also the period in which they're the most Christian, right? Because they
Hmm.
really understand what they're doing in Christian terms. So the government taking over certain social functions in and of itself, I don't think secularizes them in a substantive way. Um, it depends on what the government is oriented by. If that government is oriented by a secular understanding of social order of human life, and particularly of the purpose and aims of government, then yes, if it takes over education, for example, then the kind of education you're going to get is one that reflects that understanding of the government. But whether a government is running a school or a church is running a school or a school is independently run by a parents association or something, by itself, it doesn't tell you whether that school is going to have Christian influences or not. You have to then ask, like, well, what does the government think it's doing? What does the parents association think it's doing? What does the church think it's doing?
Well, let's get into the book then. I really appreciated the fact that you sort of you come across these Dutch Calvinists, and again, I I was junior high. I remember the first time one of my teachers said, "All of life is religious." That's been, mother's milk in the Christian Reformed Church for a very long time. Our Christian day schools are not parochial schools; they are run by parent associations. That creates for sometimes interesting politics between a local Christian Reformed church and the Christian school. Recently, I've been noting that while many Christian Reformed churches have been struggling, schools started by the Christian Reformed Church, in the United States at least, have really been flourishing, receiving a lot of people from the outside. But you sort of got into this in some ways by having to teach students about Islam and give them an appreciation for Islam. So I wonder maybe if you could tell that story.
Absolutely. Yeah, so one of my minor fields in my PhD had to do with the Islamic world. And I just loved it. I thought it was fascinating. Some of the most interesting things I read in grad school, some of the most interesting conversations around the seminar table happened in that context. And so when I came to Redeemer, they had a modern Middle East course on the books already. And over time, we added some other courses, kind of built out an area of focus. And we've now hired someone who's an actual expert on that stuff, where that's his main focus, and my colleague Jonathan Loopstra. And I've very gratefully handed those courses over to him. But for many years, I taught those courses here, and so part of what we were doing was trying to help students understand Islam. And of course, when we think about Islam through our conventional modern Western categories, we think, well, Islam is a religion. That's the box that it goes in. And what happens when we think of Islam that way is we end up importing a whole bunch of mostly subconscious things that are part of our working understanding of what religion is. We think of religion as something that's mainly personal, private, and individual. We think of religion as something that's mainly about what happens at a particular time on a particular day of the week that involves worship or prayer. We think of religion as something that has to do with particular kinds of ideas on particular topics. And then we have a whole lot of other stuff that we don't think of as religion at all. Criminal law, hygiene, inheritance taxes, right? Like we think of those things as not religion. In fact, we think of them as secular. The problem is when you look at the history of Islam, through most of its history and most of the places where Islam has been a major force in society, beginning with the very beginnings of the Islamic community, the Ummah, as they call it, in the lifetime of Muhammad and subsequently, uh, Islam is a lot more than that. It doesn't fit into those into that box. It's yes, it's a religious community of people who gather together to pray at certain times. It is that, um, but it also is a political entity. Muhammad and the caliphs, his successors, were religious leaders, yes, in the way that we would say that, but they were also what we would call political and military leaders. The early Islamic caliphates were also empires, political empires, right? Um, One of the central concerns of Islam and Islamic scholarship from the beginning was law, and not just law in a narrow, quote unquote, religious sense, but really the whole range of what are our rules for living together as a society in a way that is just. And this includes, yes, some things that we think of as religious, but it also includes criminal law. It includes what are you allowed to eat and what are you not allowed to eat. It includes regulations around hygiene, washing. It includes regulations around inheritance, marriage law, what to do about prices in the marketplace. Like that's all part of Islamic law or Sharia. And there's a whole science called fiqh, which is the science of interpreting, putting together, okay, what based on the Quran and other sources that Muslims look to as authoritative, like what are the rules for society, not just for what happens in a mosque. And there again, like a mosque and a church are not really that analogous. Yes, prayer happens in both of them. Um, but if you want to think about like who are the guardians of the written tradition of interpretation in Islam, there isn't a priesthood really in Islam. What you have are the legal scholars. They are the experts, right? And we get confused about this. Maybe we can talk about Iran a little bit later on. But when we look at Iran, they're like, oh, well, you have basically priests running things. Well, not exactly, right? Like an Ayatollah, yes, they're learned in everything having to do with Shia Islam, but particularly they're learned in the law. So they're actually a little bit more analogous to like a Supreme Court justice or something like that. Again, they don't really fit into our categories. So for my students, if I talked about Islam as a religion, I realized early on that's going to give them the wrong idea about what's happening in most periods of Islamic history and the role that Islam has played in predominantly Islamic societies. Um, so that's one of the main things that got me thinking about like, do we have some better categories that we could use to capture this other thing that's going on that's a lot broader than what we call religion typically in the modern West?
Yeah. Our So one of the things, of course, growing up in the Christian Reformed Church, this world and life view, Christian perspectives on learning. Generally speaking, when you went to Calvin College in the late 70s, early 80s, everyone had to take CPOL, Christian Perspectives on Learning, which integrates some of the stuff you're talking about at Redeemer. And part of what you learn and work on throughout your as you prepare for ministry in the Christian Reformed Church is you're going to have to do some cultural exegesis. You're going to have to figure out what the operating religion is in people who think they have no religion or they're nominal Christians. And over my lifetime, I remember Tim Keller talking about the fact that, when he started ministry, he was about 10 years older than I am. Basically in the 70s, you sort of tried to activate nominally Christian people
Hmm.
who had stopped going to church and get them back into church. But for the most part, they sort of shared a worldview. And these things have continued to migrate. I'm one of the videos I want to take on this afternoon is, I forget his first name. Pangburn, for a while back in 8 years ago, he was hosting these arena debates like between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. He managed it terribly. Looks like he's trying to get back on his feet again. And he just managed one in the UK between Glenn Scrivener, who's a friend of mine. He's an evangelist in the Anglican Church, and a guy, Stephen Woodford, goes by the name of Rationality Rules. And true or false, religion poisons everything. And Rationality Rules begins with this story of once upon a time, we were all just natural human beings and lived pure, free from religion. And then somewhere along the line, religion poisoned the well, and now we're all suffering under restrictive dogma instead of sort of being. I mean, he opens up with this story, and I thought, I don't know how you could put a fatter, slower baseball right down the middle of the plate than what you just declared. It just doesn't stand up to scrutiny on any level. But this is a story that many of the people that we live amidst simply inhabit. And what I love about how you start the book is you begin with, well, let's take this word religion, let's sort of park it over to the side for now,
Yeah.
and let's talk about a sacred social order and go back in history and say, how ubiquitous are these things? So introduce us to this idea of a sacred social order and why you think, um, yeah, almost everybody will get into secularization as to whether or not they actually have one. I would assert that they do. But what we're talking about with a sacred social order.
Yeah, so there's a lot of threads here, and I'll try to pick up kind of the most relevant ones. So one thing is, uh, it's quite astonishing to learn. Most, in fact, outside of the West, as far as we can tell, all major cultures lacked a word that means the same thing as our word religion, the way we use it in the modern West. So when Europeans go to Japan and China and India in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, they're starting to have this concept of religion. They're starting to use it kind of the way that we use it now in Western Europe, and they're bringing this idea with them. They can't translate it because there aren't words. Um, and so what ends up happening is either words get invented or more often repurposed from existing terms in these other languages. They also don't have words for what the Europeans see as their religion. So there isn't a word for Hinduism in India when Europeans come to India. So that's kind of the first clue that in these other cultures, these other major historical traditions, there's a different conceptual scheme at work that doesn't say there's this thing religion and then there's stuff that isn't religion. It doesn't divide up the world that way. And so through the process of teaching not only Islamic history, but more broadly world history, I started to run into, but they do have these other conceptual frameworks. They have these other terms. And they're terms, broadly speaking, for the alignment of all of human life, including all of the different domains of society, with some kind of a cosmic order that is higher than us, but to which we need to conform ourselves. So just a few examples of this in China, going back to like the earliest beginnings of Chinese, the Chinese intellectual tradition, you have these massively important concepts of tian or heaven, used in phrases like the mandate of heaven, the idea that the ruler, the emperor, rules by virtue of having been given authority by heaven, which is the sort of like uh, impersonal, godlike thing that governs everything that exists, that is concerned morally with the actions of human beings. You see that in the writings of Confucius, for example. And so they really want to know, like, how do we live properly in alignment with the will of heaven, the will of Tian? Another really important term in Chinese thought is the concept of Tao, the way, that there is a right way of order in the universe that suffuses what we would call like natural scientific laws that governs the movement of the planets, but also that is supposed to govern human life. There's a way to live that is in accordance with the Tao, and there's a way to live that is out of harmony with the Tao. And that's not just in Taoism as a tradition, but it's also in Confucianism, what we come to call Confucianism. And it's picked up by the Buddhists too when they come to China. So, um, what are these words for? They're not words for religion exactly, because they encompass politics, education, warfare, city planning. It's all encompassed by these concepts. Likewise, in Indian traditions, what we end up calling Hinduism and Buddhism in particular, there's this concept of dharma, which can be translated religion, sort of, but it actually translates better as kind of a law or rightness. And again, it refers to something like Tao, like this, there's this cosmic principle of the way things ought to be, of justice, of rightness, of harmony. And our job as human beings is to get into alignment with that thing. And then, of course, in more theistic traditions like Islam, there's a concept of the will of God that is manifested through Sharia as kind of like the divine ideal of law, and then through the actual practice of Islamic law as it's worked out in Islamic societies. The idea is we have to align ourselves with this higher thing that has authority over us. We didn't come up with it, we didn't make it. It's not just like a human convention or a thing that we've agreed to do. It is a thing that exists whether we like it or not. And our job as human beings is to submit to it and align with it. So yeah, you see that articulated very in very complex, nuanced, sophisticated ways over many centuries in these traditions, where they're not talking about anything that corresponds to religion in our sense, but they have these broader terms. So I wanted, like, what's a word for this idea of the alignment of human life, including all domains of society, with some kind of higher cosmic order that has to do with suprahuman things that are above the human powers and purposes. And so I borrowed some terminology from the sociologist Philip Rieff, and he articulates a similar idea, which is that social order, historically in human societies, social order mirrors sacred order. And I was like, aha, I like that. So I kind of combined that and I said, let's use this term sacred social order. And so sacred social order refers first to this, just the concept of all of human life needs to align with something above the human. So the concept that's captured by ideas like Tao and Sharia and Dharma. But then also the attempt to put that into practice historically. So you can talk about, there's an Islamic sacred social order, different varieties of which people have tried to implement in different historical eras, different places. And there's examples of this throughout human history of people actually trying, not just having the idea that we should align these things, but then actually trying to align them. So I call that sacred social order. Uh, it it I'm using the term sacred in a really specific way there as a shorthand kind of stand-in for the idea there's something above us as human beings. It's not a human thing. It's not a thing we came up with. It's higher than us. We have to obey it. We owe it reverence, respect, obedience. Often connected with superhuman beings, God or the gods, although sometimes in a more
So
impersonal
let's
form as
just make
well.
sure suprahuman,
Yeah,
because I'm really glad you made that twist because that other twist just takes us down a path. So I want to make sure that people hear you carefully.
yeah,
Suprahuman.
yeah. Yeah, it's an awkward word. The problem with superhuman is the way we normally use superhuman is like a sentence like, the kid was stuck under the car, so the dad ran in and he had superhuman strength and he lifted the car, right? We mean something that's like human, but like extra, which is almost actually the opposite of what I mean. So by suprahuman, I mean above the human. It's not human, it's above the human. It's not a feature of humanity or rooted in the human community, the human will, the human individual. It's above us. So that's what I mean when I say superhuman. So I use sacred as a stand-in for this idea that there's something above us that we need to correspond to. And then social is meant to capture, like, yes, it encompasses individual lives and things that we do in private. That's part of sacred social order. But it's really meant to put the emphasis on this is a blueprint for society, for all of our relationships, for all of our institutions. It's not a narrow domain of life. And this is how the term really differs from the way we use the term religion. Um, it's like religion is like an app on your phone. It's like one of the things you can do with your phone, right? You've got YouTube on your phone, so you can listen to Paul Vanderklay. And that's one of the things you do with your phone. It's like one aspect of what your phone can do. Sacred social order is like the operating system of your phone. It sets the structure within which all of the apps operate. And so likewise, when we say religion, we mean like, well, it's certain things that you do at home or in a church. It's like it's kind of the circumscribed area of life. And everything else is not religion. Sacred social order is the blueprint or the structure for the whole thing. Yes, for the activities that we would regard as religious activities, like worshiping the gods, but also for governing, for the economy, for education, for the handing on of cultural traditions, for the calendar, for how we think about our orientation in space, even again, city planning. All of these things are addressed by sacred social order. It's not just confined to what we would recognize in the modern West as religion.
And neither is it nicely sliced apart by spiritual and material.
Right, right.
One of the there's so many paths to go down here. One of the things that I immediately so when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic for a number of years, and so then I had to just try to get my head around their worldview.
Mhm.
I was raised in a racial reconciliation church, which was predominantly African American. So I grew up sort of in a Dutch CRC Christian school and a mostly African American congregation, pastored by a Dutch guy who grew up in the Midwest and had to learn about African American culture, et cetera. And so I've always been sort of navigating cultures, trying to figure out how to communicate across cultures. And so one of the things that as you continue to pastor, you the deeper you get into the Bible, the more you begin to realize this book is written by very different cultures than the listeners that I am trying to help connect with this book understand. Um, Stott wrote a good homiletics book, Between Two Worlds, because you're always trying to connect these
Mhm.
worlds.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I imagine many people listening to this sacred social order would say, "Oh yeah, I can see that. I can understand that." You have feng shui, which is one of these. You get all these little trickle down things into American culture, and oh, it's those Eastern religions have these ideas about order, and so when the Mandalorian says, this is the way and things like that, I mean, people get a little excited here and there. And so, on one hand, there is a hunger for, I think, a more realized sacred social order. But I think part of what I try to help people see is that this isn't merely decoration for people. This is life and death. And an easy
Mhm.
way into it, because I'm a Christian minister and at least a certain percentage of my congregation and audience have some attachments to the Bible, I recommend that they spend a little bit of time reading the Pentateuch.
Yeah.
And especially when you read through, there's the exciting Genesis is a lot of fun, lots of story. First 20 chapters of Exodus is fun, drama. And then suddenly get bogged down into why on earth are we spending so much time on the furniture of the tabernacle? And then it's the laws, and it's the laws about menstruation and what you can eat and what you can't eat, and the way things should be oriented, and all of these things. And then you get all the way to the book of Deuteronomy, that I've heard very few sermons about, even though many people sort of practice it. You get this list of blessings if you fulfill the covenant, and curses if you violate the covenant. And the book of Deuteronomy is very clear. If you fulfill the covenant, you'll have lots of children. Your flocks will multiply. You'll have plenty of rain so that your crops will grow, and your enemies will flee from you instead of you hiding from your enemies. And then you keep reading the rest of these books in the Old Testament where, it's I have this men's group. We just read through the Bible in our men's group, and you have Gideon threshing wheat in a wine press. And so I
Yeah.
ask my people, why would Gideon thresh wheat in a wine press? And of course, none of my audience knows anything about, maybe a little bit about winemaking because we're in Northern California, but nothing about threshing wheat. And I said, he's hiding. The
Yeah.
reason
Yeah.
threshing floors are up on places with where the Haitians used to dry their coffee is you want wind to come over
Yeah.
so you can hit it and then the chaff blows away, and people sort of connect with that because of Psalms. And I say the only reason you're threshing wheat in a wine press is because you know that your neighbors are waiting for you to harvest to steal your food. And if you read the end of the book of Deuteronomy, you'd know And then Gideon goes and cuts down the Asherah pole and destroys the altar to Baal. I mean, all of this is built in a world system in the Old Testament that Christians have access to. And then if you just take another moment and you realize that, oh, why do you live in alignment with the sacred social order? So you'll be blessed. So you'll succeed. So you'll be affluent and wealthy, and your children won't struggle, and your enemies will fear you, and you'll flourish if you align your and of course this remains in churches today. Every time someone says living God's way, they're basically engaging this.
Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
course, and we'll get into secularity, I would argue, is another sacred social order. It's just, much more of an immanent frame. And, we'll have to get into that stuff.
Yeah.
But I think your book was tremendously helpful in just culture after culture going through and saying, it's plain as day how at a certain point, once we've got writing and a fair amount of historical access to what people were thinking, it's plain as day what all of these societies are doing. They're aligning themselves with, let's call it reality. That's a very fairly
Yeah.
secular word.
Yeah.
And in order to flourish, in order to
Yeah.
succeed, in order to get everything that they've sort of wanted as human beings.
Yeah.
And and then, of course, this is the period in which we meet Jesus, and you find that, just like you said, I mean, some of the people you keep bumping into in the Gospels that people don't quite know what to do with, and translators for working for biblical publishers don't quite know which words they want to use. Jesus is always wrangling with teachers of the law.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
why are the
Mm-hmm.
Pharisees so careful about ceremonial purity? And well, it's because they're living under the boot of Rome. Well, why are you living under the boot of Rome? Just read the book of Deuteronomy. Because you failed the covenant. Now, of course, Christianity is going to really start to mess with this formula, but this is just the way the world works.
Yeah.
And of course, some of where I got into this again was through Tom Holland, because Tom Holland had been making many of the similar points.
Mm-hmm.
Because as he was studying the Romans, some of his early talks were on questions like, were the Romans religious? And right away you run into this question because
Yeah.
we look back and we see the temples and the sacrifices and and reading the signs and you know, to and today we would look back and say, oh yeah, they're religious, but they didn't call themselves that. And then of course we're gonna have to speed up because I'm gonna try and sell a lot more of your book, and I'm gonna try and convince you to probably make a smaller, more lay friendly version of it with an audiobook because I think that would go. But and then these Christians come along and they start doing things weird. So this is the way the whole world works. And then Christianity comes along and things start to change, but there still is a sacred social order. And one of the new elements of the world that I live in now is that um, I was educated when it was basically Protestant Catholic. And now we've got the Orthodox coming in. And you know what? Those Orthodox, if you sort of get what's going on or with them in terms of their architecture and everything they're doing, they haven't quite been through what we in the West have been through, but I don't know if we'll get all the way to that today. So talk to me about the clash, what happens with this funny revolution from just, the Romans, of course, have the best gods, and they're most in alignment. The Roman way is in alignment with the sacred social order. And the reason we know this is because their armies win. And then comes
Yeah.
Christianity and Constantine, and well, it's sort of, and I mean, I really loved how, Now suddenly we have to navigate a transition, and it isn't just sort of slap like this. These things take time, but not as much time as we might think, and it's very much not clear.
So this was for me one of the most interesting parts of the book to write. And I want to give a shout out to my brother, Tyler Flatt, who's a professor at Boyce College in Louisville, Kentucky, who is a classicist, a Harvard-trained classicist, and understands this period much better than I do. But I was able to work with him and really get into good sources on this. But yeah, we typically think of what happened in the late Roman Empire as, this new religion comes in, Christianity, becomes more and more popular, and eventually the emperor becomes a Christian, and the empire as a whole becomes Christian. But again, because of the assumptions that we have about what religion is and isn't, we tend to think of this as people following, a new set of teachings that has to do with God. They're praying in a new way. They stop doing some of the pagan stuff that we call pagan stuff. And another interesting side note there is that the word pagan doesn't come into use to mean what we mean by it until very late in the story. And so we think of it as kind of the displacement of one religion by another religion. And that's true as far as it goes. But what it misses is that what the Romans had prior to the rise of Christianity was a sacred social order. And their understanding of the gods and the larger order of the cosmos was woven into every aspect of social life, not just what's happening in the temples. So the members of the Senate in the Roman Republic, for example, and this continues into the imperial period after the rise of the emperors, the members of the Senate are also priests. They're members of the different priestly colleges. The Senate itself has to meet within a space, a defined space called a templum, which is where we get our word temple, which refers in ancient Roman times to a space where you can um, perform augury, which is different methods for trying to ascertain the will of the gods. Because one of the main functions of the Roman Senate is to ascertain the will of the gods with respect to should we go to war against this, neighboring people or not, right? So there is no distinguishing between religion and politics in ancient Rome. Um, it's also in the calendar. It's in the way they educate their children. It's bound up with everything. And so the challenge of the Christians isn't just, oh, they have a different religion. It's not even just they refuse to worship the emperor, which in Christian circles, that's usually the thing that people emphasize, because that was a sticking point for the Romans. Once you develop the idea that the emperor is a god and should be worshipped, Christians won't do that. And that's a very obvious um, kind of act of civil disobedience of the Christians. But they're threatening the entire social order, which is predicated on the gods. And the Romans were not, yes, they were tolerant of people worshiping lots of different gods, but only if they were willing to accept and participate in what was called the public cult. So the public functions in which the gods were involved. And a movement that seemed to detract from that or threaten that, or just seemed like what the Romans would consider superstition, meaning kind of like unauthorized underground religious movements, what we would call religious movements. They actually were not tolerant of those at all, and Christianity fell into that category. So what ends up happening with the Christianization of Roman society is way more far-reaching than a change of the religion. It's a change of the laws. It's a change of the political system. It's a change of the calendar. It's a change of education. It's a change of what public spaces look like and what they're used for. Um, so there's many layers to this, and it's far more pervasive. It's a kind of revolution, a social revolution across social domains, not just in this specific area that we call religion. So yeah, that's I think very illuminating because it's one of the few examples that we have in world history apart from conquest where a new movement comes in and totally overturns the sacred social order and becomes dominant in a permanent way. And just a footnote to that, and we can pick up on any of these things in more detail, but what the Christians produce then is a new kind of social order. It does involve a new form of politics. It does involve a new understanding of space and time. It does involve a new understanding of education. It involves a radically different understanding of marriage and sexuality and the value of slaves and infants and women, right? This kind of stuff Tom Holland quite rightly points out as massively transformative. So it's so much when you say they changed religion, it is true, but it is way too narrow to understand totally what's going on in this whole process.
And the process is, I at some point, it's interesting that the Jews and Jesus, let's say Israel and Jesus, this is a sort of a strange line through human history, as best as we can tell. Because as you said, there were certain sort of, Akhenaten, which is kind of an interesting example in Egypt of, oh, no, that revolution didn't take.
Yeah.
And there's some little things like that. But what's peculiar about, let's say, Israel and then Christianity and then the West is that it's all of that is sort of unique in that it isn't unique to have different competing or conflicting or sort of cooperating sacred social orders within a given society. There are a lot of examples of that. Pluralism has been around a long time. What's interesting is this massive dislocation of sort of what one is, because again, this stuff is so massive, it's just really difficult to talk about. Because one might argue that there are sort of categories, let's say a meta sacred social order that multiple examples sort of fill in. And anthropologists might do this, sociologists of religion might look at this and say, there are these functional categories that you can see similarities between different sacred social orders. But
Mhm.
as you rightly note, part of what is really peculiar about this sacred social order that we might deem as secularity is the dislodging of heaven. Because all along the board, Israel, Jesus ascends into heaven, where you sort of get this box that we get into, and there is no heaven. John Lennon sings about it. Um, why do you think that, or do you have any clues why this is along sort of this narrative thread of Israel, Jesus, Latin Christendom?
So let me reframe the question to see if I'm going to get at what you're asking about. So, like, is there a reason that this idea of secular order arises specifically in kind of the Latin Christian West
Yes.
rather than somewhere else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's getting at it, and you can run
Yeah.
with that.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so I think there's probably more than one reason, and my students know I like, as a historian, I like polycausal explanations, rather than monocausal
Amen.
explanations. It's rare that there's just the one thing that explains all the things. But I think one feature is in Christianity, unlike in these other sacred traditions, you really do early in the history of the movement have an identification of the movement with a particular distinct social institution, which is the church.
Hmm.
And that's because, Christianity is this persecuted minority movement, and the only aspect of the social structure that they have some control over is the structure of elders, deacons, bishops, eventually, the ecclesiastical
Hmm.
structure, right? And so you end up with this interesting ambivalence of the word church in the Christian tradition, which can mean so many different things. It can mean the church institution, and here I'm going to make a Kuyperian distinction, the church as institution, which is when the church gathers together under the authority of the clergy, right? That's the church, and then the clergy kind of stand in for that institution as the leaders of it. But then there's also the sense of church as like the whole body of the faithful, the whole body of Christ, all of the different Christians, also as they're kind of dispersed out in the society doing their different things. And we often don't remember that distinction, and a lot of confusion arises out of that. But it creates the possibility in Christianity in a way that is a little bit less possible in some of these other traditions, where you could say, well, this all this stuff about God, really it just pertains to this one social institution. There's like this conceptual possibility that you can do that. And you can say, well, a lot of this stuff about God, can we kind of bracket that off and put it in that domain of the church? And then regard these other areas of life, political dimensions, economic dimensions, marriage, sexuality, education, as not really directly having to do with that. And that takes a very long time. It's not until really at the earliest, the time of somebody like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, kind of that era, where you start getting articulations of this or what is moving in this direction. And I argue in the book, it's not really until the time of the French Revolution where you see anybody try to implement anything like that on a widespread scale in actual social institutions. German universities around the same time, you start edging in that direction, not as radically. So I think that the kind of the pre-idea, the earlier idea that you can kind of uniquely identify sacred social order with this specific social institution, the church,
Hmm.
creates a possibility, not a certainty, but a possibility that you can make the argument that these other areas of life should be somehow taken out from under that umbrella, which is of course what some Western thinkers start to do, and then some people actually start to implement in the modern West.
Yeah. I've been over the last couple of years spending a lot of time in the 19th century. I One of my sons decided he wanted to do a destination wedding, which meant we spent less money on catering and flowers and venue in North America and spent more on airfare and travel in Italy, which was tremendous fun. Um, European history in the 19th century and then the beginning of the 20th century, the First World War, gets really interesting because you have Italian unification, where the Pope loses, becomes the prisoner of the Vatican. I mean, and he fights for decades to just try to get some temporal authority back and eventually loses. And of course, Vatican II then is an interesting chapter in that overall arc from Vatican I with the Ultramontanism and then to Vatican II.
Yeah.
You have in the First World War, you have basically the defeat of the autocrats, the Habsburgs, the Kaiser, the Tsar, and then the Caliphate. And that ushers in, this is where the Islamic world starts getting really interesting. You see in Iran, in Turkey, in Egypt, an attempt at secularization. I would argue, and I'd really love to hear um, what you think of this. I would argue because maybe not at a fully conscious level in terms of really mapping this out, but there is a sense with the defeat of the Axis powers in the First World War that the, to use a phrase from my friend John Vervaeke, the psychotechnology that Tsarist Russia, that Catholic Habsburgs, because of course the Habsburgs, the Pope continues to look to France and Austria-Hungary to bail him out in Italy, historically, and then France, of course, gets out of that business to a degree, and then with the fall of the Habsburgs, I think in many ways that the defeat of these empires and the secularization that goes on in the Russian Revolution and then in these other less obvious revolutions in Turkey and Iran and Egypt, but other all throughout the Islamic world in other ways, is an indication of a shift. We might even call it a deistic shift or a secular atheistic shift into, well, the Western Christians discovered the laws of the universe, and those in a sense become the laws of heaven for us, and we can build what we need on them. And part of that is validated by the fact that, of course, the Europeans during the colonial period and the age of exploration just come out and dominate militarily these other places of the world. And I would say at a deeply implicit place in people's hearts begin to decide, this is the way. I don't know. What thoughts on that?
I think that's exactly right. So historians have this term defensive modernization, which I really like. And it's the idea that as you get into the 19th century and early 20th century, um, some of these other societies around the world, non-European societies, that have watched the Europeans take over so many other places, they are brought face to face with the growing technological, industrial, scientific, military superiority of European societies and kind of European offshoot societies like the United States. Um, and sometimes very dramatically, right? Like so the case of Japan is probably the best example of this, right? You have Commodore Matthew Perry sails across the Pacific and shows up outside Edo Harbor in Japan and says, "You guys have cut yourselves off from the world for a long time. Now you have to trade with us, and you're going to have to do it because look, we have cannons." I mean, that's a slightly oversimplification, but not very much. And the Japanese say, "Okay, well, I guess we have to do that." Um, and they adopt a "if you can't beat them, join them"
Yeah.
mentality, and they say, okay, we have to figure out how to learn for ourselves these scientific and technological and industrial and military advances. And the phrase they use is Japanese spirit, Western technique. And they do it very successfully during the time of what's called the Meiji Restoration in the later 19th century. And Japan transforms itself self-consciously into basically a European power. In fact, there's an essay written by a Japanese intellectual called Leaving Asia. And that's what they see themselves as doing. They become like the European powers. But there's a paradox because they do it so successfully, they can stand on their own 2 feet. They're actually able to retain some elements of their traditional sacred social order, including the imperial monarchy. And that eventually is destroyed. Well, not destroyed entirely, but what's left of that is largely wiped out by their defeat in World War II. But it lasts for a long time yet. And then you kind of have a spectrum of societies where they're able to do it more or less successfully. In China, just not too far away from Japan, in the late Qing dynasty, which is the last imperial dynasty, or as I say to my students, the last imperial dynasty so far in China, they undertake some reform efforts, partly inspired by the Japanese, but it's too late. They've already lost so much ground to the Europeans. They've already been, had all these unjust treaties imposed on them. When they do back a rebellion against foreign influence, it's quite a horrific rebellion. Actually, a lot of Christian missionaries are killed, and it goes really poorly for them. They end up occupied by foreign troops. So in China, what happens, and what happens in a lot of other societies, is that the intellectuals, particularly the younger intellectuals, the younger leaders, say the old order has totally failed and has to be replaced. And you get Sun Yat-sen and the nationalists. They overthrow. They're part of the overthrow of the last imperial dynasty. They set up a republic, which itself is later overthrown by the communists, who are kind of an even more extreme version of this. Like, let's smash the whole old order of things. In Turkey, you kind of have a similar phenomenon where the Ottoman Empire is on the losing end of World War I. They're occupied largely by foreign troops at the end of the war. And one of the generals, a guy named Mustafa Kemal, takes matters into his own hands. He's a defensive modernizer. He basically says like we need to turn what used to be the Ottoman Empire into a European country. Um, and he succeeds in establishing the Republic of Turkey. He gets them to change their alphabet from the Arabic script to the Latin alphabet. He replaces the existing code of laws, which mainly was based on Sharia, Islamic law, with, and I'm not making this up, the Civil Code of Switzerland. He's just like, these are the laws we follow now. Also, this is how we dress now. We're not going to wear the fez, which is a kind of hat that they wore that made it easy for Muslim men to prostrate themselves to put their foreheads to the ground in prayer. He's like, no, we're going to wear. He goes to a press conference wearing a Panama hat, and he says, "This is the headgear of a civilized nation." So
Wow.
there's this, yeah, there's this very dramatic top-down. We're going to become like Europeans, which means we need to become more secular, which means Islam needs to be turned into, at most, this really private thing that doesn't influence education or politics or any of this other stuff. And of course, the most dramatic examples, like I already alluded to in the case of China, are in communist societies where communists take over, like Russia itself, where they go right from this like full-blown Eastern Orthodox sacred social order of the Tsarist regime, which had been really shaken and troubled by all kinds of stuff, and it's overthrown, and then the Bolsheviks take advantage of that situation. They put themselves in power, and they just like extirpate it root and branch and set up this explicitly atheistic, self-consciously revolutionary and modern kind of extreme secular order for the society. So, that's happening in a lot of parts of the world, and secularization theorists tend not to think a lot about that history or to address it explicitly when they're trying to explain the advance of secular ways of thinking, secular ways of doing things. But I think it's a huge part of the story.
And I think we're beginning to see this interesting turn. Um, New atheism sort of reaches prominence, especially around 9/11.
Yep.
Right now, there's a lot, you have Modi in India. What's going to happen in China? That's anybody's guess. But one of the interesting things that, okay, so at the end of the Second World War, you know, liberalism is the way of the future because the democracies, they beat the communists, they beat the fascists. So Western secular liberalism is the way it is. You've got 9/11, and then the neocons say, well, we just got to run into Iraq, and once we kick over Saddam, like toppling one of his statues, you know, secular democracy will spring up like daisies. And not so much. Now, we see also, and this is part of what I saw when in the Jordan Peterson phenomena, where that was really going from, C16 in 2016, really until he was sick in 2019. That was sort of the heat of that and when it came in.
Yep.
And now with the rise, we've seen what we call the Peterson Peugeot pipeline, where, and I'm sure being surrounded by, um, well, it's a lot of my audience sort of really gets going at about 25. Some start in college, but most a little bit later. There's a sense in which liberalism is having a confidence issue. And you can read, if you read someone like Rod Dreher out of Europe, Europe is having a question of confidence. Do we need to close the borders? Because um, if we let Islam in the door, will they decide to, reinstate what they've had? I'm not convinced of that. I think and you probably have a better view of it in Canada to to a degree than we do here, where secularization is not impotent, especially with people fleeing other parts of the world, very much looking for what secularity has to offer. Yet at the same time, we're seeing a population that one of the things that that has been remarkable in my lifetime is I grew up very much um, in communities with the assumption of the end of history. And then somehow, to their horror, it didn't even just continue, it seemed to go back. And of
Yeah.
course, in the Christian Reformed Church, this has been part of the narrative from, I mean, a lot of people who had basically been imagine that the Christian Reformed Church was just going to keep following the mainline trajectory, while a bunch of people in the Christian Church are sort of watching the mainline walk off a cliff and say, is that really where we want to go? And we're facing cliffs of our own. So even though, see, I would argue secularism has its own sacred social order, but it's particularly potent in some ways, as I would assume all are, and impotent in other ways. And the further we get into it, the more impotent some of the impotence we begin to discover. And I think a lot of that was around people will tend to view, let's say, the Jordan Peterson moment as simply conservatism. And there's some of that there, but I think it's not too hard to see that in some ways conservatives this is really going to offend a bunch of people in my audience. Conservatives are a certain kind of progressives because I'm old enough now to remember what my grandparents were like. And I look at conservatives now and it's like, you want some of the things my grandparents had, but there's other things my grandparents had you certainly don't want and are not going to go there. There's no rewinding the clock and getting back there. This is what human beings always do, an attempt at a selective reappropriation of the past to bring it into the future to shore up the failures of the current regime. Now, the Iranian Revolution, I think, is a really interesting example of this. I don't know if you've done much reading or study or lecture on this. I'd be curious your thoughts.
Yeah, so it is something that I taught about in the context of courses on modern Middle Eastern history. So I wouldn't say by any means I'm an expert, but I've taught about the Iranian Revolution and thought about it a fair bit. And it is a very striking example of a phenomenon that I do talk about at the end of the book, which is kind of a backlash to or a pushback against the spread of secular orders. So we talked a minute ago about, communist regimes, other kinds of defensive modernizing regimes that typically moved their societies towards a secular understanding of social order. Um, but in many parts of the world over the last number of decades, there have been attempts to kind of roll that back again. Um, and not just to go exactly back to some prior state of affairs, but to ask if we were to take our traditional sacred social orders seriously, how could we adapt those for modern conditions and either move in kind of a pretty aggressive, like full-blown way into that, or at least move a bit in that direction in a somewhat less secular direction. And the Iranian Revolution is one of the more dramatic examples of this, right? Where you have prior to 1979, the Pahlavi dynasty and a Shah who was like, I mentioned earlier, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, kind of like a light version, a low calorie version of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. It's not as full blown as that, but it kind of similar, right? The idea that, the role of Islam in Iran should probably decrease. We need to be more modern, and that means moving towards more Western ideals of how we think about gender, the role of women, how we think about what education is for. And those were some really explosive, controversial points. There's a lot of other things going on. There was economic discontent. There was nationalism, that many nationalists felt frustrated that the Shah seemed to be too cozy with the Americans and the British. And so it's not just about secularization, but one of the reasons the Shah was unpopular in certain circles was because he was perceived largely accurately as moving the country towards a more secular kind of social order, in my terminology. Um, and then into that situation, you have Khomeini, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is a high-ranking jurist, Shia jurist, who understands Islamic law in the Shia school of Islamic law, but has developed some new ways of applying it to the contemporary social and political situation. And he says, like, look, one of the reasons so many things have gone wrong for the Muslim world, and he's one of a number of Muslim thinkers who are saying this in the second half of the 20th century, is because the reason we're weak is actually because we've imitated the Westerners. It's like the opposite of defensive modernization in a lot of ways. And if we want God to favor us again, we have to go back to living in accordance with his will. How do you do that? Well, he says we need to get rid of the Shah and set up a republic, kind of a modern idea with a written constitution, a modern idea with defined bodies who have specific powers and jurisdiction over certain things, right? We often hear Iran referred to as a dictatorship. And it's not completely wrong, but it's an oversimplification, right? They have like a pretty robust constitutional structure with division of powers in certain ways. But the leading role in the Constitution has to go to the Islamic legal experts, not as clergy as such in kind of a Western Christian sense, but as legal experts. They're the ones who know, like in the same way in Canada, we have, our 9 Supreme Court justices interpreting our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and saying, what are you allowed to do and what are you not allowed to do? Or in the US, you have the Supreme Court interpreting the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and saying, here's what you're allowed to do, here's what you're not allowed to do. The role of, and my Persian, my Farsi is basically non-existent, so my pronunciation may not be good here, but Khomeini has this idea of the velayat-e faqih, the guardianship of the legal experts, of the jurists. They're the people who understand the law, the fundamental law, the Islamic law. They get to decide what is the government allowed to do and not allowed to do, what kinds of laws can it pass or not, and who gets to run as political candidates, right? This is a modern, innovative way of doing this that Khomeini develops. There's influences on his thought. Um, but it's Khomeini who puts this all together and says, this is what we're going to do. And then he's able to take advantage of the unrest and appeal, speaking the language of many Iranians. And of course, we forget there were lots of other elements in the Iranian Revolution that were not interested in Khomeini's vision, but he's able to win out. And then we get the regime that we've had since 1979 in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So it is an attempt to say, look, we've kind of tried a secular order. We don't like it. It hasn't worked. What would a modern Islamic sacred social order, using again my terminology, what might that look like? And then you have other examples in other parts of the world, mostly less dramatic, more kind of partial readjustments in that direction. But the master trend up until the 60s and 70s really seemed like secular order is the only game in town
Yep.
throughout the world. Since then, it's been more the other direction.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the conversations that we've been having in North America and Western Europe around civilizational identity, around post-liberalism, Christian integralism or Catholic integralism, Christian nationalism. I mean, these are all kind of slightly different things, right? But what they have in common is that they could arguably be seen as part of this broader global phenomenon of saying we've tried purely secular social orders, and some people find them wanting. So, like, what else could we do? And that includes entertaining some old ideas, but also includes proposing some quite new ideas that draw on old ideas in new ways.
We got about 10 minutes left. I've loved this, and I think this conversation could go on a long time. And so maybe we'll have to do it again, especially after I finish your book and finish digesting it. And I will keep probably, part of what I often do with a book like yours is I will, because how I do my videos, I sort of digest it as I go. The videos allow me to think out loud, and I'm frankly amazed that anybody cares to follow along with me doing my homework. But anything you want to bring up, or any questions you might have, or you want to bring up in these last 10 minutes or so that we have?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'll pick up on, because you've raised this idea a couple of times. I think it's really important, that the secular order, or secular orders, are also a kind of sacred social order. And that's not true in terms of the way I define those words in my book.
Right.
But I think the thing that you're trying to get at there, I do agree with. So I distinguish very sharply in the book, at least as concepts, as kind of ideal, what sociologists call ideal types, between sacred social orders and secular orders. And the reason I don't say secular social orders is because it's redundant if there's no higher thing you're referring to. Sacred social order, there's a pairing, there's a thing above the human and the human. In
Right.
secular order, there is nothing above the human that we refer to
Right.
for social order. So when I distinguish between them, what the point that I'm getting at is, in secular order, you have to give legitimacy and orientation to the things we do together as human beings without appealing to something above the human. And so what that means is you work within what Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame, right? You brought up this term earlier,
Yep.
that it's like, heaven is closed.
Yep.
There's no heaven above us. At least for the purposes of how we're going to live together, we put that aside.
Right.
And we say purely in human terms, what's important.
Right.
And there's different versions of that. In the West, we have mainly what I call a liberal individualistic version of secular order that says, well, if we can't appeal to some kind of cosmic order or God's will or something, at the end of the day, the final authority is the individual autonomous human being. I'm an individual. I get to decide how I'm going to live, what's right for me. And that is the core principle that then gets worked out across how we think about politics, economics, sexuality, marriage, education. It's all about maximizing individual autonomy and creating a society where the most people can have the most individual autonomy possible. Um, so I call that a liberal individualistic secular order. You can also have collective versions, right? So certain versions of secular nationalism in extreme forms like fascism, Nazism, these are basically forms of secular order where it's the nation that is sacred or the ultimate value, right? In communism, it's the people, right? The proletariat. It's the value of equality, being against oppression, in theory more than in practice, of course, in communism. But there's it's a secular order, but it's more collective as opposed to the individualistic one that we have. So there's different varieties. But again, what they have in common is you're not appealing to the Tao, you're not appealing to heaven, you're not appealing to God. You're saying the things that are really important are human things, and the human society is going to organize itself based on these human considerations, period. Um, So there is this, I think, very clear distinction between that, which is a very new, recent, unusual phenomenon in human history, and what humans have normally done, which is what I'm calling sacred social order, where we are appealing to something higher as the source of legitimacy and orientation of all aspects of our lives, all of our social institutions. However, you're quite right that in a secular order, there are sacred values, not in my specific sense, but in a broader sense of there are things that we don't question that we regard as the ultimate values, which might be individual autonomy. It might be the nation. It might be liberation of the people from structures of oppression. Um, that becomes then the axiom around which the whole system of values is built and around which the social order is built. It is absolutely not neutral. It's not philosophically neutral. It's not morally neutral. So in that sense, it is analogous to a sacred social order. There are values that are sacred in that sense, just not in the sense of appealing to something
Right.
higher than the human as the anchoring point for that system of values. So yeah, I think that's unfortunately, you have to pick certain terminology and then you have to explain the terminology because a lot of these words could mean legitimately mean lots of different things.
Right.
But I think that's an important distinction to highlight.
A lot of what I started basically seeing Jordan Peterson talk about the Bible. I thought I could talk about the Bible too. And then people wanted to talk about Jordan Peterson's talking about the Bible and myself. And then, of course, that brought me into connection with Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke. And part of that, I mean, recently it's been interesting to follow John Vervaeke's journey. He grew up in a fundamentalist community in Canada, um, very much sort of traumatized by the rapture, some of these things, got out of there pretty quickly, young, got into Eastern spirituality, Buddhism, Taoism, then eventually got into cognitive science, was the first chair of Cog Sci, University of Toronto. When I started making videos, some of my listeners said, "Oh, you should see what John Vervaeke's doing with his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis." And so then for a while he was working on a a set of an ecology of practices to approaching it from a cog sci perspective, but also fairly open. Originally called them the legacy religions. As he's been on this journey himself, he's pivoted into one of the last phrases he was using was the return of the sacred. And what's happened around Jonathan Pageau, very much in line with that, the renewed interest in Eastern Orthodoxy, in, let's say, Latin Rites Catholicism. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with Quebec. I think right now these movements demographically are fairly tiny
Yeah.
in terms of the mass of people in the West. But one of the things that I saw with Jordan Peterson and nihilism was John Vervaeke sort of nicely walks out why at the end of liberalism there's a nihilism that really begins to inhabit people. And Peterson, of course, sort of with his Jungian archetypes, but that sort of becomes a staircase by which people have tended to re-enter into what John Vervaeke called the legacy religions. And I think initially John was imagining something that we've seen often in the 19th and 20th century, which were attempts to, I mean, sociology arguably, you got into a little bit this in the podcast. Sociology arguably is an attempt at a collective secular religion. I was on Unbelievable with Justin paired me up with a guy who was doing these secular assembly things that people were trying to do on Sundays. I mean, this has been a dramatic failure. And one of the things I said to John Vervaeke early on, I said, if you understand just even from a secular perspective, the evolutionary power of these legacy religions, they are so battle tested. They've been through so many generations and permutations that the practices, the psychotechnologies, using John Vervaeke's language, that these things have, you're going to be hard pressed to really come up with anything that, looking at the span of people and the span of time can really compete with that, even just from, let's say, using biological analogies. If, let's say, you were able to invent a species in a lab, which wasn't just another hybrid of something else that has been around in nature for a very long time, it would probably just simply die because you can't possibly think of everything in the world and it's not going to go. And so what we see in the 19th and 20th century are all sorts of these sects that grow up and cults, but the process of them is almost always absorption and adoption into the massive movements that go.
Mm-hmm.
And, just thinking further, I tend to think we're going to see this process continue. And I wonder to the degree um, that even secularity won't itself be absorbed um, into, and I think that's what we've seen in the 20th and 21st century, sort of absorbed into the larger things. But it's way too early, and these things move way too slowly. So I don't know. It's always a temptation to ask historians what they think is coming. But the only way we can orient is looking backwards. So historians are as good a people to ask as anyone, frankly. So any thoughts in terms of, well, obviously you teach at one of the very few Christian universities in Canada, so maybe that tells us where your chips are placed.
Yeah, well, I think there's a few layers where I could answer this in terms of historical trajectories, sociological things, the interplay of ideas, and these things move a little bit independently of each other, not independently, but distinctly. I do think that the different forms of secular order, particularly the liberal individualistic form, is still really, really strong. And yes, it hasn't been around for nearly as long, but it is really effective at appealing to people and it can inspire devotion. It makes a lot of sense. And of course, it has the advantage right now of being interwoven through every institutional domain in the world's dominant societies, right? Including the ones that we live in. So it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But it does have certain weaknesses. It has certain conceptual or intellectual weaknesses, of course. And it has been increasingly questioned as inadequate with respect to being just a good way of thinking about social order and politics in general by intellectuals of different stripes, more than was the case, let's say, in the 90s, at the end of history, as you alluded to earlier. But I actually think the bigger challenge for the liberal individualistic variety of secular order is whether it is demographically sustainable,
Hmm.
because it does not seem thus far to be very good at creating the kind of society in which enough people partner up, form families, have enough children, and kind of follow a life script that results in that. And I think, I mean, it could be coincidental, but I'm more inclined to believe that it is actually kind of built into the liberal individualistic order, because the idea of a life script that, like, part of your purpose in life is to get married and stick with that person and have kids and sacrifice for them and raise them successfully to maturity. A lot of that involves subordinating, sacrificing, mortifying, to use Christian language, your own individual interests, and being happy doing so. And of course, we do have natural instincts, which of course I believe are put there by our creator, which do actually lead us to seek to do that, even when we don't have a good reason to do so, to pledge ourselves to another person, to sacrifice for our kids. And a lot of my friends who are living within what I would call a secular liberal individualistic framework, you see them do that. But it's hard to explain why you should do that other than just you feel like doing it, right? So at the level of a whole society, it seems like the more secular liberal individualistic understanding of the purpose of life and how that translates particularly into these domains of family, marriage, children, life purpose, satisfaction, it doesn't seem like it's very good at getting people to form families and have kids. And if I'm correct about that, what you have to do then is to get people from somewhere else. And I don't necessarily mean immigration, although that is, of course, one of the obvious solutions is you bring in people from other societies. And the other thing, though, is, of course, you recruit people from more quote unquote religious traditional groups within your own society.
Hmm.
But you have to convert them to secular liberal individualism. Otherwise, they just take over, right? And they could be the Amish, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, Muslims, all kinds of things, right? So I think that is actually the big challenge. And so one of the things that over the course of the rest of my lifetime, I don't know how long God plans to keep me around here and how many, more years or decades I may have less left. But, if I'm still doing this for a couple of decades, I'll be very curious to see how that plays out. Um, and in the context of a world as a whole where there's increasingly a demographic crisis that's coming. So yeah, that's the closest I'll get to a future prediction. I
All right.
I see that as a challenge for the secular liberal
Do
individualistic
you know
movement.
who Malcolm and Simone Collins are?
No.
I'll send you some videos.
Okay.
They came onto my radar screen because they looked at the demographic challenge and decided that what we really need to do is invent a new religion that
Hmm.
is fundamentally individualistic, atheistic, but takes this into account. And so they have a YouTube channel, and I've had a
Fascinating.
couple of conversations with them. It's fascinating watching. The internet gives us these windows into all kinds of attempts by people to take on these challenges. One last question. Any thoughts about making a smaller, more popularly oriented book on this at a cheaper price? Because I think your book is really important, and I think a lot more people should be thinking along these lines.
Well, I'm honored that you think so, Paul. And yeah, we'll see how it goes. I mean, if I continue to see this level of interest, then there may in fact be a market for it. And I will, when the time comes, want to pick your brain about how to go about doing that and make this a little more accessible for folks.
Wonderful. Well, I will end the recording, but I want to thank you very much for giving me your time and
My
really
pleasure.
appreciate your work and really excited to see where all this goes.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Paul.